There's a revolution going on in the United States right now of a can-do. We're going to reassert our economic power, and we're going to do things that Ronald Reagan dreamed of, but he never could do. We've already had 1 million people self-deport. Everybody said that was impossible. They would never do it. Donald Trump said, you get $1,000, we'll pay your way home, and you can apply for a green card. If you do not self-deport and we catch you, you will not be allowed in under any circumstances. When you look at the popularity of the Democratic Party, it's at an all-time low. Whether that translates into a sure Trump victory, I don't know. But historically, in the midterms, every incumbent loses anywhere from 10 to 40 seats. There are people talking that the Republicans might pick up seats and might pick up a Senate seat or two. That would be an amazing accomplishment if that happens. But there's no question that there's criminal exposure there. And when Obama was asked about it, he just said, well, the election was very controversial. If you're disinterested and analytical and empirical, it was much worse than Watergate. You had the FBI and the CIA and the Director of National Intelligence coordinating with Hillary Clinton to destroy a campaign. And then when he was president, those same actors reemerged to further that narrative and get Robert Mueller, who knew there was no collusion, to spend 22 months and $40 million to find nothing, no culpability, and basically ruined the first 2 years of the Trump administration.
Well, Victor, thank you very much indeed for your time again. I really appreciate it, particularly given that you've got a very great deal on your plate. It's a very good and important opportunity for Australia to try and hear something more of the American perspective of the global outlook at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, John.
Could we begin the Epstein list, now dividing the MAGA movement? The White House and many other senior conservatives are saying now that it perhaps never existed. What's your take on the whole Jeffrey Epstein saga and whether or not the list exists and what's really going on here?
I think there's a list, but it's not a list that was compiled by Jeffrey Epstein and his associates. It's more that in his 2 trials, from 2007 all the way up until 2018, there were names that came into the investigations. These were people who had texted him, emailed him, that had been seen with him, and so all the files that had been, I guess we'd use the word suppressed, had a lot of names on them. And I think people have said there's 170 names. But the problem was that no one really knows the status of why those names were there. There were actors like Bruce Willis, Leonardo DiCaprio, Kevin Spacey, Alan Dershowitz, the lawyer, Bill Gates. But nobody really knows whether these were people that Jeffrey Epstein was soliciting to manage their money, whether they were just socially aware of them. And so I think the Trump campaign thought this is going to be an easy thing to do. And then when they came into power and they began to prepare to release these scattered names, people called them and this is kind of conjecture, but it's out there as the most logical explanation. People started to call and say, look, Jeffrey Epstein called me, I called him back, that's why I'm on his phone records, or I met him at a fundraiser at Harvard, I discussed his project, I met with him for lunch. If you release these names, you're not going to discriminate between the people who are actually engaged in this illegal pedophilia or the people who just knew him. So I think for a moment, the administration, I think wrongly paused and said, it's ancient history, there's nothing there. He did commit suicide. And then when the base went kind of ballistic, that fed into the left-wing general, attack on Trump for everything. And the administration got blindsided. Now I think the answer is they're just going to let all the names out and let people with Freedom of Information Act suits or on their own try to sort it out.
You can easily imagine there would have been a lot of people with powerful motives to see to it that Epstein died in his cell, perhaps even Epstein himself, who he presumably would not have wanted to have faced the publicity and the long sentence in a cell as a convicted child trafficker. What's your take on those theories around his death?
Well, there's a missing minute or so in some of the video surveillance, and the people who were in charge of surveilling seem to be incompetent or asleep at the wheel, and that's prompted these questions. I guess I know I met Don Bongino, the assistant FBI director. I know Kash Patel, and I can tell you that when they were out of power, they wanted everything released, and they have come to the conclusion after reviewing things, I think they're going to release it, that it's more likely that he was looking at the American prison system and what they do to people who are pedophiles. That is the inmate population. It's not good, and he was not going to get out of it this time. He had no more cards to play. He was looking at 20 or 30 years or the rest of his life, and he may or may not have offered some of the surveillance people money or special influence if they would allow him to put a noose around his neck. In other words, they would not intervene. So I think there was some type of complicity, but I'm not sure it was to murder him, but maybe to facilitate his suicide. But there's certainly laxity there, and it was probably by design.
If we could come to the global geopolitical outlook, you and I have often talked about Australia as a mid-sized but very important ally for America, the affections Americans have for Australians. We are roughly the size in economic terms of Russia, but we're only spending 2% of GDP on defence, rising gently to 2.3% over the next few years, plainly seriously out of sync, not only with what President Trump is expecting of us and your defence minister, but also out of line now with what NATO is doing, given that they've, at least on paper, committed to going to 5%. We now have an AUKUS review, or a review of AUKUS going on. Can America really spare submarines? Some real pressure coming on from Mr. Colby around the question of would Australia join with America in the event of a conflict over Taiwan. This is going to be an interesting standoff. Our Prime Minister has just spent 6 days in China. He's had 4 meetings with the President of China. He's not yet met the President of the United States. So on the one hand of the ledger, you've got the great affection between the Australian people, the importance of Australia as a base, the view that the Australian people don't quite know how to handle the president, but they do look to America for as a major strategic ally. On the other hand, China's terribly important to us on trade terms, and presumably our Prime Minister is trying to balance the relationship. But I can't help wondering, just in the end, what the president might say and what other serious players in America might say about Australia's lack of commitment to defence expenditure, especially when all our own experts from all sides of politics, virtually all of them, are saying we actually really do have to do a lot more. That's a long statement, but I just wanted to frame it up. As an Australian, I'm very concerned about what is happening and how we might be positioning ourselves with America at the moment.
Well, Trump is more transactional. His ideas, as I said before to you, John, he's a Jacksonian. He's not an isolationist. He's not a neoconservative nation builder. He looks at areas in where we have lost deterrence vis-a-vis Iran, or in the case of the Houthis, Hezbollah, and then he acts if he thinks in a cost-to-benefit analysis it's a solvable problem. And he looks at countries that share the same values, and that is Australia, most of the former British Commonwealth, Europe, Japan, South Korea. But I think that he assumes there's a moral difference, is what I'm talking about. In the case of China, the way they handled the COVID-19, that probably originated in the lab. They were sending people all over the world for 12 days when they knew that it was what it was, and they would not allow you to fly out of Wuhan to an internal Chinese city. And yes, they were sending millions of people to Italy, Europe, the United States, both coasts. Then there, the Uyghurs, the way they've treated Tibet. It's a totalitarian state, and so why Trump is not looking for, he's looking for a détente with them. They run a $300 million surplus with us. They run about a 1.3 surplus with the world. And he's trying to rectify that. What China is trying to do is it goes to people in South Korea, Australia, Japan, Taiwan even, Philippines, and it says, the United States is a setting sun and we're a rising power. And when push comes to shove, we don't ask you to join with us. We just like you to stay apart from us. And I think that's the message they send. The larger problem for Australia or New Zealand or Europe, and to be frank with the United States, is we say we're going to go to 5%, but we're only about 3.3, and yet we're asking the Europeans to go to 5. The argument that is made is that in actual investments and military power, we're so far ahead of Europe that we can be at 3.3, why they have to get to 5, but I'm not sure that's a convincing argument. And that's because we all share certain pathologies, and one of them is a declining birth rate. I think we're down to 1.7 from 2.1 just 25 years ago. I know Australia's down. Europe's down to almost continental-wide 1.5. And then we have immigration. 16% of our country, it was not born in the United States. That's about where it's mostly from the southern hemisphere, but in the case of Europe, it's mostly from Islamic countries that are the people coming do not express a desire to assimilate, integrate, intermarry, etc. And so you got Britain and France and Germany, Greece especially, and they have very high populations of non-assimilated, in some ways hostile minorities, very dependent on social services. They've got a declining birth rate, and they bought into this new, I guess we'd call it Green New Deal idea about energy. So the energy cost in Europe, for example, are about double. They're even California, which is the highest of all 50 states, they're higher than California. And that's because of the subsidized wind and solar at the expense of fossil fuel development. Meanwhile, China is building 3 coal plants a day. So what I'm getting at is there's a lot of restraints in the West on the available money. There are all these countries in the West are going up to 120% of GDP as far as debt goes. And when you have an aging and declining population, and you've made some ideological but not market-based decisions on energy use, you cannot, for some reason, handle the immigration problem. And then you have these skyrocketing pensions that are unfunded. It's very hard to, no matter what they say, these countries, how are they actually going to come up with the money? And so they said, I think Gerald Baker in the Wall Street Journal today or yesterday said, this is all fine to promise 5%, but what they're really doing is telling Donald Trump, we're going to promise 5% so we can get along with you, but when you're out of office, there's no way in the world we would or could meet that goal.
These are very frightening numbers that you refer to. China itself, of course, will face a free fall in its population. It's fast approaching, but whilst that may rearrange things 20 years down the road, in the short term, it seems that we're in a very dangerous place indeed. And so you've plainly got a tussle going on in America now between whether involvement in Europe and NATO and the swing to containing China and its intent. That problem of indebtedness, Ferguson's law, Neil Ferguson puts it that when a great power's interest on its debt exceeds what it can spend on defence, it doesn't remain great for long. On the other hand, we saw the technological capability of the Americans with the strike on Iran. What would Beijing be making of America's real capacity?
Well, when you look at certain, I think they feel they're rapidly, with their shipbuilding program, they're rapidly closing the gap, but that gap will be sizable for a decade. And so I'll give you some numbers roughly. We have about 6,500 deliverable nuclear weapons there. They feel that at the end of the year they may have 1,000, and in 5 years they may have 15 or 2,000. Strategically, we're way ahead of them. We're way ahead of them. We have 11 carrier groups, and I don't know how they were catch up to there. The carrier group is about a 50 billion to 100 billion investment with the submarines, the frigates, the associated ships in that group. We have 11 of those. We're starting to combine a lot of people in Silicon Valley, which is a very good development, to pivot into quantity over kind of World War II quantity now. So we, in the works of this big beautiful bill, is about $180 billion to create a lot of low cost, effective drones, sea drones, land drones, air drones. So that's favorable. China has fourth generation fighters. I think most people feel that the F-35, the F-22 are superior. They could not do what we did in Iran. They don't have that capability. And it's clear that their relationships, because of border disputes with Russia and India, are not going to make them permanent allies. They're allies of convenience in some cases because of the Ukraine war and Russian oil, but they're not in a good strategic position. China isn't, and they have a demographic problem. So most of their strength has come from Western complacency. And I think right now what they're trying to do is solicit opposition to Donald Trump. They fear him enormously because what he's basically saying is, we're not going to have an immigration problem. We're not going to have a border problem. We're not going to have a military budget problem. We're not going to have a naivete about Chinese surplus problem. And we're going to invite in foreign investment. And Doug Burtham, the Interior Secretary, the other day said that there was on schedule $15 trillion of foreign investment into the United States. All of Silicon Valley is $9 trillion. Everything, every company there. So you can see that there's a lot of known unknowns here in the United States. We don't know the effect of the exact... The classical wisdom about moderate tariffs has been proven wrong. The Wall Street Journal was at this time said we'd be in a recession and a trade war. And we may end up that way. But when you look at taxing remittances, taxing university endowments, at the same time giving cuts to productive people and encouraging energy development, Doug Burtham said we have $100 trillion in developable assets. That was timber, minerals, oil, gas. We've never really been here before that somebody has said, we're going to use all of our natural resources asset. We're going to invite in all this capital so there won't be tariffs on them, and then had that response. And we're going to go to Silicon Valley and high tech, whether it's Andreessen or Horowitz or David Sachs or Zuckerberg or even occasion Elon, and say, we want to protect you from the European censorship or harassment or regulations, and we want to partner with you on things like defense spending and AI, robotics. So there's a lot of people that feel that there's something in the air that nobody can figure out. Usually May is a month where you get increased revenues, but we haven't never had a May in 8 years where the actual federal revenues were higher than the expenditures at a time we're supposed to be running a $2 trillion debt. We'll see what June and July are, but in other words, all this foreign investment, tariff income, targeted taxation against certain protected sectors of the economy, like the universities or the $63 billion that go to Mexico and remittances. All of these things here and there are starting to add up, and there's a sense that this deregulation is the most radical deregulation that I've seen. And there's things in that big, beautiful bill I had no idea they were in there. It's got everything, if anybody looks at it. And it's all has one thing in common. How do we get more revenues and less cost and without tanking the economy? And even the most pessimistic people say, well, it'll add $3 trillion to the deficit over a decade, but that's by 2% GDP estimates, and I'm not sure that we'll be stuck at 2%. So everything is going to happen, I think, in the next 6 months, one way or the other, and we'll see. The only thing that people are worried about on tariffs, the symmetry argument is what appeals to the American people. If they tariff us, then we're going to tariff them. If they run up huge surpluses, then we're going to try to surplus them or get even. But when you get to countries like Australia or Israel or the UK that are running deficits with the United States, then that argument has hurt Trump, because people have said, well, why in the world would you increase the tariffs on countries that are already running a deficit with us and our allies? They can stomach it with Canada for all the rhetoric and everything. People do feel that the rhetoric was excessive, but there's no reason for Canada to run a $63 billion surplus with us while they're spending only 1.3% GDP on defense, and that's been for 11 years. They just won't budge. And so he had legitimate complaints, but the idea that you're going to use tariffs to punish enemies that are running a deficit with us as a revenue, that's a hard sell.
Nonetheless, it does appear that the tariff increases in the United States will bring a revenue flow, as I understand it. And I think that's probably being missed in the arguments globally and in countries like mine, where it's just assumed it will be a tax on consumers. These are traditional arguments, which are very understandable and to which I've subscribed, broadly speaking. Nonetheless, it is likely that they will bring in income.
Yeah, I think everybody's shocked at what Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, said the other day, and he's a very careful person, a Wall Street old hand. He said that there is a good likelihood that Trump could get about a third of $1 trillion, $330 billion in revenue sources alone. And then he said something, and other people have echoed him, that we don't really know what the profit margin is with our big deficit partners that are running surpluses with us. We have deficit. Germany, Japan, South Korea, and especially China. We don't know whether they were making 20% product, 30% profit, but we do get the indication that the tariffs so far have not been punitive enough that they want to exit either the U.S. consumer market or they price themselves out of the market. In other words, most of these countries with huge surpluses with us, they have absorbed the tariffs without increasing their prices to make them uncompetitive, and yet they're still making a profit. And that's what everybody's shocked about, because that's against conventional wisdom. And we haven't seen we were told it would hurt job creation and GDP, but we haven't seen that yet. And so if anybody were to read the Wall Street Journal News Division, March, you would have thought that by now, according to their prediction, we would have had a recession, we would have a stock market, almost a collapse, we would be in a full-scale trade war, GDP would be sinking, inflation, stagflation would be rising, and the deficit would be exploding, but we just haven't seen that. We've seen the opposite of it. And now if you look at articles today, it's almost amnesiac. They don't even calibrate what they were saying just 3 months later. They just say, things are going pretty well. Business leaders are optimistic. There's new technologies. There's new encouragement for AI and robotics and foreign investment. And it's just a different tune. And they're very hostile. The news division is to Trump. So I guess they feel something is in the air with tariffs and trade and new sources in the big, beautiful bill about deregulation and tax cuts and tax increases on certain areas that we hadn't seen before, like the universities or like remittances.
If we could drill for a moment into your thoughts about you're a student of war and of your area of expertise, it's amazing how often history can be reinterpreted. So there was a speech here which we assumed would have been quite widely heard in Washington from our Prime Minister, in which he claimed that his World War II predecessor, a man called John Curtin, a Labor leader in Australia, that Curtin had pushed strongly for greater self-reliance from both Britain and America during the Second World War, and that he, Albanese, the current Prime Minister, would therefore do exactly the same. It was taken as a we will determine our way forward. There's a couple of problems with it. One is a historical misinterpretation. In fact, Curtin, and during the Second World War, moved mountains to keep firstly Britain and then the US involved in Australian security. And when General MacArthur arrived here after the fall of the Philippines, he was given complete control, something that still amazes me as a former legislator we would never have agreed to that as a government, complete control over our armed forces. So it was quite an inversion of history by our Prime Minister. And we assume in this country that it will have been seen as a message to America that we will decide what's appropriate for us. We're going to stick to 2%. We assess that's enough. Even their own Defence Strategic Review said they needed to do a great deal more, but social programs are apparently more important. It is an interesting question as to, firstly, the misinterpretation of history in an age when people don't know their history can be used to try and recast the debate in ways that are very unhelpful. And secondly, I would have thought, begs a question as to just how Washington might react when they start to focus on where Australia's at with defence.
Yeah, I think it's, to be quite blunt, it's a very ignorant reading of history. The problem that Australia had was, along with Canada, they joined Britain very early in the war. So take Tobruk, for example. They had a heroic defense, but you had up to 2 divisions in North Africa. And Australians were deployed in many places far from Australia in the Pacific when Japan declared war on Britain and Australia and the United States. And so one of the agreements between Churchill and Roosevelt was that the United States would, as a sphere of influence, at least till 1944, when you had the British very involved with the Australians in Burma and Mountbatten and all of that, and Slim, who I think was a New Zealander. But up until that point, in that critical 42 and 43, the United States agreed to partner with Australia and to take up the slack to protect Australia. I'll give you one example. After the bombing of Darwin, the United States felt that the supply lines to Australia were critical. The Guadalcanal campaign at the end of September, October, November, December of 1942 was aimed at keeping supply lines and keeping Australia in the war. Second, the Battle of Coral Sea that took place just 6 months after Pearl Harbor was sort of co-planned. I mean, the Americans fought there, and they fought to a standoff strategically with the Japanese Navy, but it really stopped cold the New Guinea invasion and the idea that Japanese carriers and troops would be right off the northern coast of Australia. And that ended that threat entirely, and it was confirmed a month later at the Battle of Midway. And so they were very integrated. I'll just give one personal anecdote. My father was based on Tinian and the Marianas, where he was a central fire control gunner on a B-29 in late 44, 45. 45, they moved to Tinian. And he flew his B-29 to Australia. I mean, his crew did, for rest, relaxation, and outfitting, supplies. And what I'm getting, and there were Australian, I guess you would call them military consultants, all through the war. So right after Pearl Harbor, as you know, there was a combined fleet, and we didn't have very much, but it was the Dutch, the Australians, and the United States, and they didn't do well. None of them did. They lost 5,000 men. They were really hurt at the Java Sea battle. But the point I'm making is they were integrated within weeks after Pearl Harbor. And it was one of the foundations of the Pacific strategy that Australia would not have to pull every soldier out of their deployment in league with Britain, because the United States was going to ensure that they were going to be kept in the war as they gradually pivoted back to Australia's immediate enemy, Japan. So I can't think of a month in World War II when there was not direct partnerships between the two countries. And then I don't know, excuse me, why the Prime Minister is saying that, but Australia has a powerful economy. It's got a continental-sized country, but it doesn't have the GDP of the sort that would allow it to produce on its own sophisticated fifth-generation fighters or sophisticated submarines or craft that would rival the Chinese, or would to have the wherewithal if China decided to target Australia. It just wouldn't have. It would be forced into a dilemma, and that is to give concessions. And so it's kind of ironic, because I think of all recent presidents, Donald Trump is probably the most pro-English speaking, and in particular Australia, than any president that I've seen. He's talked about Australia in very glowing terms, as he has the UK. The only two countries that he seems to be having problems with are Canada, and that's because of the surplus and the NATO failure, and also New Zealand, because New Zealand is always to the left of most of the British former colonies. But I don't understand why the Prime Minister would want to stake out a more independent position vis-a-vis China, because it seems like you'd be sticking your head out of a foxhole as an easy target, either to be coerced or in times of mortal danger, you'd be on your own. I don't think that would be wise at all.
The problem with this misinterpretation of history is that, on the one hand, we're continually told, particularly by the Defence Minister and even the Foreign Affairs Minister, who is quite left-wing. I think that's not verbaling her. I think that would be a true statement. She's, for example, a very tough on Israel, would be to put it mildly, in the current circumstances. But they are warning that these are the most strategically dangerous times since the 1930s. They seem determined to distance themselves from at least the Trump administration, if not the Americans, but they refuse point blank to do anything serious, even in terms of their own reviews, the so-called Defence Strategic Review, to respond to what everyone's saying about the need to do more. At the same time, as you're not preparing people, you're not being honest with them. The reality is that you Americans are so embedded here with, the Pine Gaps of this world, the intelligence gathering architecture that's here, the bomber bases, the increasing numbers of troop and material rotations through Australia, that we are almost inseparably enmeshed anyway. And this is, as I see it, a failure of leadership at a time when Western leadership should be as tight as a drum in the face of the arc of autocracy that plainly has nothing in common. Its members have nothing in common with one another except their loathing of the Western Alliance.
Yes, I don't understand the timing as well, because I could see that there would be doubt after the withdrawal in Afghanistan and after the lackadaisical approach to Iran versus Israel, where the prior administration begged to get back into the disastrous Iran deal. It kept pressuring Israel. But if you look at the current state of affairs, Russia has lost about 1.1 to 1.2 million dead, wounded, missing in Ukraine. There's the outline of a peace, but the problem we're having, and Donald Trump has now sort of pivoted and is really, he said he needs leverage on Putin because Putin was not receptive. But Putin, I think, understands that he hasn't got enough to make a deal without some kind of oligarchic or military pushback to him. In other words, he's not doing well and he's bleeding. And the United States is going to be supplying Ukraine, at least in the short term, despite the MAGA protests. And then when you look at the Middle East, if we had this conversation, my God, a year ago, we would be talking about the formidable Hezbollah, or Hamas is just, nobody knows how to deal with them, or the Houthis. And Iran, it was, I don't know why that paper tiger got such a reputation. It had never won a war since the theocracy came into power, but nonetheless, it had a fearsome reputation. And then in 28 minutes, the United States flew freely into its airspace, destroyed for a decade its nuclear infrastructure with no losses. The only problem was we asked the Israelis to enter Iranian airspace. That's the height of humiliation for the Iranians. They have no air force, they have no navy now, they have no air defenses, they have no nuclear program, and at will, any American president or Israeli prime minister can enter their space. So the whole Middle East, is what I'm trying to say, is radically changed now. And if you look at Europe, whether it's rhetorical or not, it's quite dramatic that they are now looking at China in terms of trade as we do. And I never thought I would see that, at least rhetorically. They're making all of these fantastic promises to go up to 5%. Here in the United States, Donald Trump came in with 55,000 short recruits. We were told these were structural problems, from gangs to drugs to obesity to competition with the private sector to declining fertility. And in 3 months, all of the military recruitment shortfalls have been met or exceeded. We had 10,000 people in one day sign up in this period. 55,000 have joined the military. There is no more DEI. It's back to Americratic. If you look at the commercials, it's be all you can be, people jumping out of helicopters, scenes of combat. There's no more women pregnant in flight suits or DEI indoctrination or trans stuff. It's all gone. And the result is that there's been a new mood. So what I'm getting at, if you survey the global scene in the West, this is not a good time to suggest that the West can't be counted on or you would like to distance itself. It's because what's going on is kind of a military renaissance and a waking up that China poses an existential threat, as does the China-Russia-Iran alliance. And they've made enormous strides to deter and to make them weaker and us stronger. And so I don't know why else. I could see it if your prime minister was worried, say in 2021 or 22, but I would be worried after Afghanistan. But right now, Donald Trump has promised, as I said, $150 billion on new shipping, build up the Navy, and we haven't had anybody speak like that since Reagan. And I think he's serious. He's going to do it. And, they're talking about, I just went to a talk by a Silicon Valley, one of the most powerful people, and he said, we have fifth generation aircraft that can stand 9 or 10 Gs, but we're making drones that will operate at 20 Gs, and we're going to make a lot of them. And I have never seen that partnership between what I thought were left-wing tech barons, the people I mentioned, and the government. It reminds me of the William Knudsen, Henry Ford, Henry Kaiser partnership of the War Production Board in World War II. It's really different that you would have these tech barons going to Trump of all people and saying, you get out of our business and don't tell us who's winners and losers and who's going to get to do AI and who's not. Give us the energy, and we promise we will produce new age weapons that will ensure American military superiority. And so that's what everybody's talking about here. At the Hoover Institution, the amount of conferences, consulting on new age defense strategies, weaponry, integration with Silicon Valley's never been higher. There's no longer any, you guys are on the right, we're on the left. You don't see that. And so I don't know why your prime minister would not sense the pulse of the times.
I couldn't have put it better myself in terms of sensing the pulse of the times. I think there's a number of things there that might be going on we'll come to in a moment. But firstly, that's a stunning thing that you've just told us, that American recruiting and retention has turned right around. Yeah. That tells you something about the soul of the nation, I would have thought.
Yeah, it does. And what people did not want to disclose in the Biden administration, it's very hard to find the data, but it's discoverable that of this 55,000 shortfall, about 90% were rural, middle-class white males that felt that the DI, the drumming out of people who had natural COVID immunity but refused to get either the mRNA initial shots or the boosters, I think there was 8,500 of them. That was the group that felt, and they were multi-generational families. Their grandfathers that typically had fought in Vietnam. The father fought in the first Gulf War. The kids fought in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the young 18-year-olds wanted to follow in that tradition. And remember, in Afghanistan and Iraq, if you look at the fatality breakdowns, white males died at about 75% of all deaths. That's double their demographics in the general population. And yet that administration, the prior one, deliberately alienated that one group. And when you don't alienate them and you say, we're not going to judge people by their tribe, and you say, we did the prior administration did look for white privilege and white supremacy in the ranks, and then quietly a year later released a report written by more people on the left that they found no such cabal, but they had alienated that group. And when you don't alienate them, now they have made up their own shortfall. All the other groups by ethnic affiliation had been pretty steady, but that group, which we count on for good or bad, I don't know how you would want to term, but we count on that particular demographic to go to ungodly places like Kandahar or Fallujah, or be stationed in the Red Sea, and they want to be in combat, and now they're back in just spectacular numbers. And there's a whole mood in the country right now. If you look at the defense contractors, Anduril, for example, the Silicon Valley, and now it's building drones, it's building all sorts of new weapons, and the types of people who are in the defense industry, when you look at them, they have long hair, they're techies. They're not your Northrop necessarily, General Dynamics, Lockheed, Raytheon traditional executives. So there's kind of a sense that this administration has invited people who you would associate with the left and saying, you people may not like us, but you were being regulated to death, and the Europeans were picking on you, and we're going to let you do whatever you want. We've got deregulation, we've got tax incentives. We want you to make money and make us money, and we want you to develop products that help your country defend itself. And it's been amazingly successful. I was very skeptical of it.
So this is a very interesting counter to the concern that we've had for so long about China, that they've broken down the wall between, if you like, the private sector and the government sector, that industry, that research and innovation, technology are one and the same as defense in China. And that's been very different in America. But you're painting a picture now of industry and government and the national interest coming together.
Yeah, and I think China, the reason that China has not gone into a trade war is that there were a lot of things the Trump administration said to China that were not publicized. We have about 310,000 foreign students. They make up about 30% of Harvard's, here at Stanford, about 25%. And when Donald Trump came in, he said about 70% of all these foreign students are from illiberal regimes, either China or the Middle East. And what they do is they deprive American meritocratically that could make the test scores and grades to get into these schools. And 1 to 2 to 3% of them are actively engaged in espionage. So they have told the Chinese that we're going to reconsider how many students you can send to the United States. And for a lot of reasons, domestic reasons for fairness and equity, but also worries about technological appropriation. And that's in addition to the surpluses they're looking at. And we just passed in the big, beautiful bill, we're outlawing this 250,000 acres of acquisition of Chinese farmland near American bases and strategic locales. And so Trump thinks he has a lot of pressure on China under the radar, and he's been very tough with them about trade. But he says everything's negotiable. And so there is a sense now that the left that was very fond of China, I was at a group of corporate leaders not too long ago, and I was very surprised that in prior years they had soft pedaled China, and this was a place to invest, and now their tune is very different. We still have the edge on them, and they're doing things that they don't even realize that are suppressing innovation. Their fertility and aging population is catching up with them. Their command and control economy is not flexible. It's not entrepreneurial, and they're really a parasitical society that depend on Western technology. And we can stop that if we want to, very easily. And when you look at the United States now, it's about 110% self-sufficient in natural gas and petroleum. It's in terms of value of farm products, it's got the largest farm sector in the world, not by acreage, but by value. We've just opened a huge rare earth plant in the Montana area. There's talk about another one in the desert of California. Doug Burgum, the energy secretary, just announced that the United States will have $15 trillion of foreign investment, and he thinks we have $200 trillion. And I don't want to use the word exploited, but unused natural resources, coal, petroleum, timber, minerals, that they're on federal lands that they're going to start developing in a responsible way. He gave a talk that I went to not long ago. He said the average permit in the Interior Department ranged up for 2 years, and they've got it down to 21 days. So there's a revolution going on in the United States right now of a can-do. We're going to reassert our economic power, and we're going to do things that Ronald Reagan dreamed of, but he never could do in terms of taxation, deregulation, use of natural resources, etc. And this is aside from the cultural. We brought in all the universities and said, you better cut a deal now, or the public is going to learn that you're charging 55, 60% on federal grants. You've got segregated dorms and graduation ceremonies in violation of the Civil Rights Acts and the Supreme Court rulings. We want to tax your endowment because you're not nonpartisan. And you better we're going to look very carefully while you're recruiting all of these foreign students to make money off them at 110% of the costs that you charge Americans, and Americans are denied entry to these blue chip universities. So, and then of course we just defunded PBS and NPR because we felt that they were one-sided, and the Mexican government was bullying us. It was telling us they're going to do this, they're going to do that. They're going to intervene on illegal aliens. There is no illegal migration now. It just simply disappeared. 12 million came in. Last month, I think there was 111 people apprehended at the border. They're finishing the last 1,500 miles of the wall. We told Mexico the $171 billion surplus is unacceptable. We're going to tax the $63 billion that your expatriate who are here illegally and subsidized by us with state, local entitlements, and yet they free up cash. 63 billion. The 20 billion your cartels suck out of our economy, 70,000 killed. All of that's being addressed as we speak. And nobody's ever thought that the United States would do that. And it's got a lot of bad publicity that we're too hard, but it was long overdue.
One of the reasons I think that there's been a great reluctance in recent times to call out China, if I can put it that way, in a lot of circles in Canberra has been because of a fear of an electoral backlash. The coalition had been very assertive, particularly under Scott Morrison, about the real intentions out of Beijing. But unfortunately, I think probably used language that offended many Chinese citizens. That is to say, when we talk of Beijing, we should be talking about the Chinese Communist Party. It's really important, I think, to point out that given the opportunity to be free, to live in vibrant, free enterprise democracies, no one loves that environment more than the Chinese. Think of Hong Kong and look at what they're now going through if you want an insight as to what we're really worried about here. It's not the Chinese people. It's communism, if you like, a bastard offshoot, you could argue really, of the European Enlightenment with Chinese characteristics. This is a real problem in our country, coupled with the extraordinary degree, and I suspect it's much worse than many of us realise, of the clever way in which they've infiltrated our institutions, including our learning institutions, probably quite a bit of the media, the bureaucracy and so forth, with messages and with actual people on the ground, boots on the ground in all sorts of positions, doing their bidding. So you've got this sort of great fear when I don't think it's so complicated as to how to talk about Beijing without offending Chinese people. Not so much of a problem in America, I think, but it's certainly become a problem here.
I think part of the problem was the Chinese Communist government was very, very adept in their propaganda. I'll give you an example. When Donald Trump called it the Chinese virus his first term, almost immediately China said, this is what you guys did to the Japanese in World War II. This is the yellow peril scare of the 19th century. You're discriminating. And they appealed to the 12% of Asians in the United States and made that propaganda that they were part of the DEI project. They were just the global representation of Asians who were being discriminated in universities in America. They really played that up here. We had a lot of high-profile China, Fang, the notorious operative from the Chinese Communist Party, who was a consort of Representative Swalwell. And that was the narrative we heard, and it was very effective among left-wing circles that anybody who is pushing around China is a Donald Trump racist. And I think the United States got a little bit smarter with that and started talking about the actual 2 or 3% who are engaged in espionage, which, given the numbers, is pretty large, 5,000 or 6,000 students. And I think we've never been more open and candid about support for Taiwan. A lot of people, and we have never been closer militarily with South Korea and Japan. We've got some trade issues, but I think China has almost failed in that effort to convince Americans that if you're skeptical of the Chinese government, then somehow you're a anti-DI, anti-Chinese racist. That was what we heard in the universities. And I can tell you that the Stanford Review student magazine ran an investigative series of articles about Chinese students that were terrified of the Chinese government because they're all indoctrinated and questioned before they come here and when they leave, and they don't want to be. And the article was by anonymous Chinese students that were telling the coercion that the communist government puts on them and the dangers they feel that they're in if they don't cooperate and the dangers they feel they're in if they do under the new administration that has zero tolerance for it. But the thrust of the paper was sympathetic to Chinese students. And one thing that's very clear here in the United States is the majority, because we've had 6-7 generations of Chinese Americans, the vast majority are pro-Taiwanese and hostile to the communist government. And because of the nature of immigration to the United States, we still have multi-generational Chinese families that don't speak Mandarin. They're Cantonese, and they're not part of the mainstream Chinese narrative, and they have strong relations with Taiwan. And so I don't think that's going to work as well as the Chinese thought, that propaganda effort.
Well, you paint an encouraging picture of the potential for America to, if you like, rise again. I'm particularly interested, for example, in the idea of growth being the possible solution to that horrendous $32 trillion debt. You'll never pay it down. Even just limiting the size of the public service or cancelling foreign aid internationally, those sorts of things, hardly dent it. You've got to outgrow it. It's the only real option.
It's a structural problem. The only way to get out of it is if we had adopted the Obama-appointed Simpson-Bowles Commission of 2009 that he appointed, bipartisan, late Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles. They had a tripart new tax system. It was very incremental, but had that been adopted, as everybody thought it would in 2009, we would have about a $7 trillion national debt. And it would have, over that long period of 15 years. But the only way to get out of it is we have to achieve a GDP at 3 to 4%. We have to have a lid on spending. And then you're looking at 30 or 40 year periods where we can grow our way out of it, so that 33 trillion is a debt of a 40 or 50 trillion dollar GDP rather than a 30 trillion. We're spending $3 billion a day now, a third of $1 billion. We're spending $1.1 billion in interest and about $3 billion a day. Everybody's aggravated that Donald Trump keeps hammering Jerome Powell, but what he's really saying, that the subtext is, I can't get close to physical sobriety when you have these interest rates. If you'll lower them a point or two, we'll pay $2 billion and not $3 billion, and that will save us a third of $1 trillion in interest. So they're trying to figure ways, at least they're talking about the debt in a way that we never did when Biden just, post-COVID, $7 trillion, Build Back Better, Inflation Reduction Act, Green New Deal, all that stuff. And it was not good. It wasn't put to good use, the borrowed money.
Well, very conscious of your time. Just to wrap this up, I have a couple more issues, if I could, arising out of that. Of course, what we see, particularly with our media in Australia, which is so hostile to Trump, endless stories highlighting division, chaos, hatreds in America. And I'd be interested in your take on how Americans are more broadly feeling about their country at the moment. For example, I understand that Trump's just ordered a proper investigation into the finding announced by Tulsi Gabbard that there was no evidence of Russian cyber manipulation during the 2016 election, when President Obama apparently ordered the White House to propagate the narrative of that Russian interference. So these sort of conspiracy theories, you've seen it again over Epstein, the deep divisions, the great passions and what have you. How do we see, from somebody who's not in America, the soul of America? You've given us a fascinating insight with the recovery of recruitment and retention in the military. That tells you something very powerful about a shift in almost the spirituality of the place, if I can put it that way. But the divisions, the hatreds, the passions, the conspiracy theories, how do you see them unfolding? Are they starting to ease as people?
Yeah, I think so. The barometer has always been, do you feel the country's headed in the right direction? It's always about 60-40 no, 70-30 no. And it's starting to crawl up. At one point, it was almost 50-50. The problem with the polling about his popularity is that there's about 15 polls, and we all have a record of them, in the 2024 and 2020 and 2016. So if you look at those 20 polls and you look at Insider Advantage, Trafalgar, or Rasmussen, Donald Trump is dead even, or even a couple. If you look at Harvard Harris or Quinnipiac, the polls, he's down anywhere from 3 points to 8 or 9. But if you look at the polls, those same polls, how they called the 2016-20, they were off by a wide mark. NPR poll has him down by 7, but they said on the eve of the election, 24 hours before the 2024 election, that Kamala Harris was going to win by 4 points beyond the margin of error. So there are polls, and then there's polls that have records. If you so he's doing about as well as could be. The way I look at it, John, it's kind of like we had a cancer going on of open borders and a loss of deterrence, and the chemotherapy is very hard to administer. It's very easy to let in 12 million people, 10,000 a day, and say you're magnanimous, and not tell the people that they're crowding ER rooms for American citizens, that your dialysis clinic is going to be packed with people who've never been to a doctor from Guatemala. We have a huge overhead and parity entitlements for housing, legal aid, food, etc. But it's very hard to find them and enforce the law. It was almost if the left said to us, it's very moral to break the law. And now they're saying to us, it's very amoral to enforce it. So it's bad publicity to find these 500,000 felons. But we've already had 1 million people self-deport. Everybody said that was impossible. They would never do it. Donald Trump said, you get $1,000, we'll pay your way home, and you can apply for a green card. If you do not self-deport and we catch you, you will not be allowed in under any circumstances for a year, and you'll go back on your own expense and time. So it's what he's trying to do is rectify things that were kind of nonsensical and were feel-good stuff. Let's just make wind and solar. Let's just get out of Afghanistan. But the corrective to that is very difficult. The other thing that's happening very quickly is that the legacy media, CBS, ABC, NBC, CNN, MSNBC, NPR, PBS, all of them have had dramatic drop in viewership, and many on the right have sued them successfully, and some of them are going to have their subsidies cut off. But what's happened is this podcast, what we're doing right now, has flooded the United States. So if you look at the viewership of CNN, it's about 400,000. If you look at Joe Rogan's, it's 70 million. And when you look at Jordan Peterson, and you look at the podcast ratings, it's something else. If I went somewhere in public 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, to the degree anybody knew me, it would be they'd come up and say, you write a syndicated poem. I wrote a book. You're on Fox News 3 times a week. But that was, to be candid, it was kind of rare. If I go anywhere now, 5 or 6 people come up to me and say, I listened to your podcast, which we have a huge, I think we're number 8 on Amazon now in news and politics. But my point is that genre is dominated now by conservatives, and it's getting that news out in a way that we've never seen. So when Tulsi Gabbard makes these disclosures and the mainstream media says, oh, this is revenge, this is cynical, you can't do this, there's another narrative. And the other narrative that the people are seeing is that when Hillary Clinton in the campaign and during the first months of the Trump administration, and Obama said 17 intelligence authorities have sworn that Donald Trump colluded with Vladimir Putin. Now we're learning that 17 intelligence authorities never said that. They said the opposite. They went to Brennan, they went to Clapper, and they said, look, you ordered us to find collusion. We could not find any collusion. What did Brennan and Clapper do? They went into the White House and said, these are what we think. What do you want to do? And then now we're into a he said, she said. They say Obama said, give me a different intelligence appraisal. And Obama says, well, they gave me the appraisal. But either one of them is lying. And when you get Comey into to the equation, he's got a lot of problems. Then the other part of this story is we have people who have lied under oath and have admitted to doing. John Brennan, the CIA director, lied twice under oath and he admitted he did concerning surveillance of Senate computer staffers, collateral damage, and predatory drones. We know that James Clapper lied under oath about spying. He said, I gave you the least untruthful answer. James Comey pled amnesia 245 times under oath. So there's a lot of exposure there. And it's just a question of how far does the Trump DOJ want to stop all that? I would say to your Australian people on the left that it did affect an election. In the 2016 election, the Russian intelligence was tapped by the Dutch, and the Dutch reported back to our intelligence, we don't know what's going on. The Russians don't know we're tapped into their intelligence, but they're baffled because they haven't colluded with Donald Trump, but they have tapped into Hillary Clinton's communications, and she's saying that they have. And they want to know why this is, and they came to the conclusion that she's lying about the Russians because she was trying to protect her own emails, which were on a server that shouldn't have been, and she had information that shouldn't have been there. But so it's just a question now, how far do you want to go back to rectify what happened, and what would be the political ramifications? And the country's split on that issue. On the right, people say, wait a minute, if you let these people lie under oath and you let them go in front of the country in 2020 and swear before the second debate that Donald Trump and the Russians created Hunter laptop, that it was Russian, and you knew that that was true, and you knew that the FBI had it in their possession and had authenticated it, and you knew that, and yet you tried to arm Biden, who was armed, and said Donald Trump's a liar, he's a Russian colluder. And that may have affected that election. And there was one poll that said it did, that people did believe that Donald Trump created that with the Russians, that laptop. So there's a lot of fundamental issues, and I think the Trump administration doesn't know quite the political ramifications, how far back you can enforce a law, how you deter this from happening again. But there's no question that there's criminal exposure there. And when Obama was asked about it, he just said, well, the election was very controversial. And Brennan Clapper just said, I'm confused. I don't know. I didn't do anything. I don't know what went on. The FBI colluded with Facebook and Twitter to suppress knowledge of the laptop's authenticity. So I guess part of the problem, just to finish this too long excursus, but no one has ever tried to remove a major party candidate from the ballot. 25 states tried to remove Donald Trump. No one has ever raided an ex-president's home, and they took out 14,000 documents, and they found 102 that were classified, 0.001 or something. And Joe Biden had the same exposure. No ex-president and leading presidential nominee has ever had 93 criminal indictments. Now we know that Fani Willis, Alvin Bragg, Jack Smith coordinated with the White House. Nathan Wade was in the White House the same day that Jack Smith was appointed, the same day that Michael Coangelo, third in the DOJ, went to work for Alvin Bragg. So we've never seen any of this. We've never had a president who was impeached twice, tried as a private citizen. And so what do you do about it? And do you bring it back up, or do you just say, well, that was an aberration? But if you're disinterested and analytical and empirical, it was much worse than Watergate. You had the FBI and the CIA and the Director of National Intelligence coordinating with Hillary Clinton to destroy a campaign. And then when he was president, those same actors reemerged to further that narrative and get Robert Mueller, who knew there was no collusion, to spend 22 months and $40 million to find nothing, no culpability, and basically ruined the first 2 years of the Trump administration. And so there we are, and I think everybody's torn. What do you do about it? It's so huge and gargantuan. If you came from Mars and just said, "Oh my God, this was a coup," but But yet to dig all this up and go through it, everybody said, "Oh my God, I don't want to go through this again." And that's what people are torn about.
All of this reflects, I'd have to say, very, very poorly on the Democrats. Where to for the Democrats now? From afar, it doesn't look to me as though they're learning any of the lessons very well. And it doesn't look to me as though they're throwing up leaders who understand that they are not in sync with their own country anymore.
Yeah, we went through this in 1972 when they had looked back at the 68 election. Anybody who had any sense saw that Hubert Humphrey was considered too left, and he was moving to the center and catching up to Richard Nixon. He lost only by 100,000 votes. So we thought the Democratic Party, when I was a young high school, everybody thought that they would move to the center. Instead, they nominated George McGovern 4 years later and went hard left and suffered the fourth largest landslide in history. And although they did have Jimmy Carter and his Southern accent, he was only a one-term failed president. They didn't get back on track until 92 with Bill Clinton, who ran deliberately from the center. So when they looked at they're looking at the 2024 election, and everybody knows that they lost because Kamala Harris was a poor candidate. Joe Biden was basically non compos mentis. More importantly, that she was so far left when she was on record that stopping all fracking, no deportations, defund the police, vocal support for the George Floyd, often violent riots, that she had no credibility and she tried to back away from it. So what I'm getting at is, in a autopsy, most people thought they would look at this and say the Democratic Party is out of touch and they need to nominate a Josh Shapiro or Andy Bashar or a Bill Clinton-like figure and go back to bread and butter economic issues, strong defense, strong borders. 1996 Democratic platform, if you read it, it's to the right of Donald Trump on immigration and on crime. But they didn't. Instead, it's the AOC, Jasmine Crockett, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. So they're saying, and then we have people like Mamdani, this Fatah, who's running for mayor in Minneapolis, Gavin Newsom, and Karen Bass here in California. So to the delight of the conservatives, they are going further and further left and doubling down and getting angrier and angrier. They have no power in the House. They have no power in the Senate. They have no power in the White House. They have no power in the Supreme Court. They have no power in referenda because whether it's transgenderism or the defense budget, they're 30-70 on the wrong side of the issues. And so it's performance art. And some of it works. I mean, Donald Trump is a fascist. Hakeem Jeffrey poses with a baseball bat. They publish these smutty videos where congressmen and senators say the F word, the S word. It's kind of circus-like. Jasmine Crockett every day releases a video that old white men have ruined the country, and yet when you look at popularity of the Democratic Party, it's at an all-time low. Whether that translates into a sure Trump victory, I don't know. But historically, in the midterms, every incumbent loses anywhere from 10 to 40 seats. The only two times that has not happened is with Bush after 9/11. He picked up 2, and then Roosevelt in 36 picked up seats. He lost them again in 38. But there are people talking that the Republicans might pick up seats and might pick up a Senate seat or 2. That would be an amazing accomplishment if that happens.
Well, Victor, thank you very much again. As you just pointed out a moment ago, this is the age of the podcasting, and it is fascinating to realise that the mainstream media is losing out hand over fist and doesn't seem to know what to do about it, because straightening up their ship, being objective, being fair, being seen to be people of integrity is the real answer, of course, for them. There is an interesting aspect of it that is worth considering, and that is that our research in Australia suggests to us quite strongly that young men in particular are just as likely now as middle-aged or older men to tap into podcasts, to listen to what's going on. They're finding themselves much better informed than if they're just on mainstream media. I'm sorry, mainstream media, but that's the reality. And they're being influenced by it. And many, not all, but many of the people they're listening to are not only telling them what's really going on, they're saying, have a go, accept your responsibilities, be a good citizen.
I think so.
The reality, there's a slight flip side to it, which is that young women are still not tapping into current affairs as much. And so you're seeing this bifurcation where younger men are drifting back to the centre, younger women are still drifting off further to the left. And that in itself is quite a challenge.
I think a lot of that has to do here that 55 to 56% of all undergraduates are women now. And a lot of the men are turning to technical trades that tend to be more conservative. The other thing is that the podcasts here, what makes these podcasts popular to young men is there's no makeup, there's no sophisticated sets, there's no blown dry hair, and there's no equivocation. I know that there's been times when I've been very blunt. I've disagreed with the Trump administration, or I've said things about the universities where I work at a university. But the key to these podcasts is that people turn in and they just expect somebody to tell the truth as they see the truth and not worry about all the flashy accoutrements of what a TV set is. When we heard that Stephen Colbert is angry because he was canceled, he was spending he was losing $40 million for a small audience. He was getting $20 million. So there's a sense that people just want a normal person to go on and they want them to tell the truth. And if you can bring in history or, in my case, if I can talk about agriculture or military history and try to ground contemporary events with reference to spark people's further interest, that's a bonus. But I know that if I were to go on and scream and yell or to use profanity or try to just give a straight Trump line and not be analytical, I would have no audience within a month. Because we've done research on that, and we know that veracity and candor and kind of a decorum is what young people want, young men. And that's counterintuitive, but they do not want you to go in, scream and yell and swear and talk about things that won't affect them. They don't want to hear, everybody says they want to hear about sex and violence. I don't think so. They want to hear about everything from can they buy a house, what's the economy, what's the value of a college education versus a trade school, what should they be reading even if they're not in a school, what should they know about history, how should they treat women, how is it a good thing, again, to have 2 or 3 children? Can they buy a house early? Those are what they're interested in. And when you give them that without bias, they respond to it. But they don't respond to CNN or MSNBC or The View or all of those people. They don't feel they're honest.
Well, I can, in a way, tell a story against myself in that people come up to me now and say, I'm inclined to listen to you more now that you're not a legislator, you're not a politician, than I did when you were. So, Victor, you've been incredibly generous again. So from a farmer in California to a farmer in northwest New South Wales, talking about things that surely determine what's going to happen for our children and our grandchildren, I can only express my deep appreciation and to say it's an incredible privilege and a very highly enjoyable to be able to talk to you.
Well, thank you for having me, John, and good luck.